Our fourth seminar of the day is chaired by Derek again, hopefully in a better area than his Star Trek interest. It's an area we're a lot more comfortable with. It's the psychological side of caregiving. Derek, who I've said before has been on previous panels and seminars, is interested in the recognition of the carer role in head, neck and beyond, and the communication they are given in head, neck care. He's going to run a panel in relation to this. It's going to include a psychologist and head, neck survivor, cancer survivor carers. Is that right, Derek?
Almost.
It is almost. The carer is, as we said before, it's a very important role that we have in head, neck cancer care, but it's often poorly recognised by those who are trying to give it through the NHS. So I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about this. Derek will introduce his panel and the topic after a short video. Thank you, Derek.
What hit you when you first discovered that your patient had been diagnosed with cancer?
It's a while back now, so let me cast my mind back. To be honest, when we went to the hospital, you sit in like a particular area, and I realised that they were getting the room ready to tell us in. I don't know what made me know, but it was just kind of like, I was watching these people go in and I thought, God, there's a lot of people gone in there. This is not going to be good. But I didn't mention it to Chris because I'm not going to panic him yet. So when we went in, they were all sat round, 5, 6, might have only been 4, I can't really remember a number. But I remember thinking, right, this isn't good. But I didn't panic. I didn't worry about it. I sat and looked at the screen that they were showing us where the cancer was, explaining it to us. And I just took it all in, to be quite honest. Chris didn't. He didn't freak out, but he just kind of glazed over. But I was quite calm coming out of that, and I just thought, right, where should we go now? Get him in the car. What does he want to do? Wanted to go and see his brother, so I drove him there, and then we drove to my mum's. And that was the first time I got upset telling my mum. And then that was about it, really.
Had you had any carer experience before that?
To me, a carer is somebody that's there 24/7, and I wasn't. I had to continue with work, and so I never really classed myself as a carer.
But you are there 24/7, even
well,
when
you
you're at
are,
work.
yeah.
Even when you're at work, you're still there 24/7.
I mean, obviously, I then have to run the household, go to work, do the washing, the cooking, the cleaning, without any help at all. And Chris has always been a good help around the house and dropping the kids or picking them up and stuff like that. But from near enough day one, he went into complete meltdown, really. So he's diagnosed on the Friday, and by the Saturday morning he's decided he can't eat. Peg feed, can't do it himself. So he can't sit there and put the pump on or put the feed through his peg. No, I have to do that. So that became really difficult, and that was probably the hardest bit we had. So not only have I got 2 kids I'm running around and I'm going to work full time, but I've got to feed him before I go to work, and then when I come in, he's not moved from that same seat. So there's no wash being put on or put out. And, it's head and neck cancer. It's not your hands or your legs. You can still get up and you need to walk around. And that was our biggest problem to get over.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this session on psychological perspective on caregiving. As I quickly introduce the panel we have today, first we have with us Dr. John Donohue, senior clinical psychologist, and as caregivers, trust me, we're always interested and welcoming of a psychologist supporting who we are, what we are, or where we're going, or what we should be doing. We don't have enough of it. In fact, most of us don't get any of it. So it's great to have you, John. I'll come back to you in a moment. I believe we have Kelly from Farm Foods. Kelly, I apologise. You were thrown into this mix at the last minute, and I just got a quick notice saying you're with us. So do you have a presentation to make? Or are you just here to join in the discussion?
I'm just here to join in the discussion. Okay. Hopefully I can help. Yeah.
Okay, great stuff. And I've also got with me Andrew and Debbie, the 2 caregivers. The three caregivers here, myself included, we are all at different stages of the caregiving process. And if we start at the top end of the process, Debbie is currently very active with her husband looking after and giving care to him, as he is still in relatively early stages of treatment, and Debbie is definitely battling away with that over in sunny Spain. I hope it's sunny over there, Debs. Yeah, it's sunny over there, Debbie.
Yep, nice and sunny, windy, but sunny.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Andrew is at an entirely different stage of his caregiving process, in that Andrew has been caregiver to his better half for many years now. Poor old Joe has had representation of different forms of cancer over a number of years. So every time they think they've climbed the hurdle, something comes and hits them, and they take a step backwards and they go through it again. Fingers crossed it is getting towards the end of that journey now, but Andrew is definitely has been probably the longest serving caregiver out of this particular group. And my story is very slightly different. Some of you know it. Unfortunately, my caregiving only lasted a very short period of time, 6 months, and then my wife didn't make it. She lost her battle to mouth cancer. So we all have different experiences, and each of us had a need for some help and support at various stages of our caregiving career. And I think it's fair to say, guys, it just wasn't there until we found the swallows. So it's great that we can get together and have a little chat. Before I introduce John, a couple of things. First of all, pardon me, we heard from, I think it was Paul Schneider yesterday, as a patient, and he made the comment that there was just no psychological support to his journey. We also heard just recently from the three amazing ladies that told their stories about survivor guilt. Well, ladies, I'm sad to say that there is such a thing as caregiver guilt, where we all think, why was it him or her and not me? And finally, in the presentation we heard from the professor on statistics, pardon me, it always happens when you're talking, doesn't it? We heard the message, the forgotten, don't let cancer be the forgotten C in COVID. Well, I have another message, and that is, don't let the forgotten C be the caregiver in cancer. And on that message, I'm going to ask John if you'd like to introduce himself to everybody. And I believe you've got a presentation for us, John. John, you're on mute. Oh, there you go.
Okay. So can everybody see me and hear me? Is that,
Yes, we can see and hear.
Okay. If anything technical kind of goes wrong, just let me know. But I suppose I just want to say first off that thanks ever so much to both Chris and Sharon and to others at Swallows for the opportunity to speak to you all and join you all today. It's a great pleasure, and I hope hand on heart that I do this a little bit of justice, because I'm just mindful of the stories and accounts that have gone before me. So I am appreciative of the opportunity, but I approach with humility, because I'm able-bodied. I don't have disease. I haven't been ill. So I approach this topic with humility, but with the hope that it will be sort of helpful to people in general. So the topic, as has gone before me, is it's about the area of the psychological impact of head and neck cancer on caregivers, and I'll be giving about 20 minutes or so to this. Just a little bit about me, I guess. I'm John. I'm a psychologist that works in the northwest of Ireland. I've worked in oncology and clinical hematology for a good few years now. I worked in a specialist oncology service in the West Midlands for quite some time. So I was on the wards essentially, and I worked both with patients who are inpatients, patients who are outpatients, and the staff as well. And so by the time that I left my tenure there, the profile of the psychological needs of patients vastly elevated from where I when I started. And the reason for that is because acute medicine is obviously a very medical environment, and it's very quick and it's very busy. And one of the things that can get lost is actually the psychological. But I suppose just kicking off a little bit of research off the top of my head, research was done by King's Fund back in 2010, overseen by a lovely psychologist by the name of James Brennan in Bristol. And one of the things that they found is that they polled about 400 patients. And what they found is that actually the biggest issue was worry. It wasn't to do so much with pain, and it wasn't so much to do with sort of other sort of side effects, but it was actually worry and fatigue. So I think there's huge scope for psychologists to be involved in the whole thing. So moving to the topic at hand, what I want to do is to be quite tight today and quite neat in what I'm speaking about. So there's three areas that I essentially want to cover. And I just want to cover, being a psychologist, we're always interested in findings and sort of what's evidence-based. And so what we want to do is look at some of the research findings on caregiving. And I'm just going to do a whistle-stop tour of that. And what are the things that kind of make caregiving kind of harder? And I was even struck by already that in a little piece of video just before my talk here, that actually some of the key things were raised. And I have to say, a kind of that sort of balancing act is a really key area in terms of what makes things particularly hard for caregiving. I can't comment too much on the idea of, well, the reality of caregiving guilt, but it does not come as a surprise to me that is a reality, and actually maybe we need to speak a bit more about that as well. And so finally, what I would like to do is maybe think about some of the ideas about managing sort of what's going to help and what's going to help caregivers over the longer term. So cancer affects not just the individual patient, but their family and loved ones as well. That's obviously the case. And informal family caregivers of patients with cancer who are symptomatic and experience functional issues particularly may be at higher risk for poorer mental health outcomes themselves. Lots of studies have actually documented these kind of issues that faced by caregivers. And what are the issues really? What might they be? Well, these are things like disrupted personal schedule for a start, disruption in in career advancement, so people's livelihoods and the ideas that they would have about where they're going in life, career-wise, may be utterly disrupted. Loss of contact with friends, that people will. I noted, I think it was Sylvia who said that actually her life is kind of online a bit now. But what we're noticing is that there is a loss of contact with friends, and ultimately the risk of burnout is quite high. On some of the other literature around caregiving, broadly speaking, burnout is a risk around the 6-month period because It is the build-up of things. Now that's not going to be the case in every case, but there seems to be an argument to make the idea that it's around the 6 months kind of mark that things can get really contrary for people, particularly in the caregiving role. And this also an issue that caregiving load, so the volume of activities that people have to do, and it suggests that the sort of that caregiving hours, if you like, are associated again with negative psychological outcomes. The caregiving role can occupy the caregiver at the expense of their own self-care, and in some cases their self-identity, that they get lost. This is also true for patients themselves, that suddenly, let's say for instance me, I'm John, I'm a son, I'm a brother, I'm a photographer, I do X, Y, Z. But if I were to become ill, that might coalesce into just one identity, John the patient. And it can become the same for people who are in the caregiving role as John the carer. So what it is that an estimated 20% to 63% of caregivers of patients with cancer report psychological distress, defined as, broadly speaking, elevated levels of depression and anxiety. And this might be accompanied by decreases in very important psychological artifacts and psychological nutrients. So there would be decreases in caregiving esteem, which refers to the positive attitudes towards caregiving, and feelings of joy or contentment, or conversely, feelings of distress and resentment from caregiving can have consequences on both on the caregiver themselves and their sense of worth and their overall quality of life. So there's a range of what's called unmet needs that caregivers may have, that's found in the literature. And of the different unmet needs that caregivers can have, daily activity unmet needs seem to have a much wider impact. So what kind of impact does it actually have? Well, loss of sleep, loss of quality sleep is a big one. Daytime fatigue, so people feeling that they're running out of energy, and interruptions to work-life balance, and poor social support. So when we talk about daily unmet needs, what are they? They refer to the needs that are associated with daily living, such as personal care, the fulfillment of personal interests, having and moving towards personal aspirations, and actually choice, the degree that I have agency and choice in the situation. So what's the example is that giving that caregivers would often be in that situation of having to either reduce or even leave their full-time jobs to care for their loved one, and eventually affecting their work-life balance. And you may recall in the video, that was the thing that was actually quite, one of the things that lady mentioned was actually kind of getting that right. It struck me that there was so many plates spinning, so many balls in the air, that was really, really taxing for her. And it's also worth noting as well that caregivers can face this internal dilemma, this internal conflict with regards to daily activity. So on the one hand, if they do take personal breaks, if you do take personal breaks from caregiving, sorry, my apologies. If they don't take personal breaks from caregiving, their physical and mental well-being deteriorates. But the problem is that for many, if they do take personal breaks from caregiving, they may experience guilt for doing so. So it's a kind of a Hobson's choice. It's almost like choosing your poison, which is a terrible dilemma to be kind of faced with. So what I'd like to do is to maybe look at two pieces of research. I'm not going to turn this into an academic lecture. I'm not an academic, I have to say myself. But I think there's two particular pieces of research that I think that I'm going to try and condense into fairly straightforward terms that might be relevant and interesting for us to look at. So the first looked at things like are there implications on the caregiver, specifically in the domain of unmet needs, as treatment of their loved one continues. So, and I'll take a look at the findings of each of them. So, what they're actually looking at is the composite of time in relation to unmet needs. So, is there anything to say about, as time goes on in the caregiving context, are there sort of effects on people? And the interesting thing is that, funny enough, there's only one paper that I came across in my limited search that actually kind of looked at this. And they used particular kind of scales to kind of measure this out. And what they came up with is that there are four types of unmet needs. And they kind of described them as psychosocial unmet needs, medical unmet needs, financial unmet needs, and daily activity unmet needs. And I'm sure that I imagine when we get to the quick Q&A, there'll be kind of an extension of those as well. So these four factors were divided into others, and of interest in these subsections. They examined caregiver personal care, which is getting help from others in order to take time for yourself. So that's caregiving personal care. That's a really key idea. And the other one was role management for survivor care, which is that intrinsic property of balancing work or school or college with caring for the person who is poorly. So what do they find? Well, in short, basically, greater unmet personal care needs, that has been going on for when their loved one has been undergoing treatment for 6 to 9 months, compared to the situation under 6 months, was related to higher depression and anxiety. So that's that key kind of thing about that 6 months that I mentioned earlier on, that there seems to be something about that 6 month kind of milestone that seems to trigger an increased vulnerability, let's say, to anxiety and depression, and also to stress as well. So in sum, the shorter the treatment, the less likelihood of problems such as anxiety and depression. Now, that's not the case in every case, but it seems like that's what just seems to trend out there. And what also they found is that the greater unmet personal needs among participants in this research, whose care recipients have been undergoing treatment for more than 9 months, compared to less than 6 months, was also related to higher depression and anxiety. So again, with those two kind of things so it seems like the longer it goes on, the kind of harder it may become. So if we kind of look really at these phases, kind of under 6 months, and then the intermediate between 6 and 9 months and then beyond, I'd like to just make some remarks about that. And say in the early kind of acute treatment phase, there are certain things which are that preoccupy. The medical issues seem to predominate. And very interestingly, when working with cancer patients themselves, what they find is that, funny enough, is when you're actually under treatment, particularly if it goes on for months and months and months, in a strange way, one feels contained by the medical treatment and that corresponds to unexpectedly kind of lower levels of anxiety and depression. But I think when people begin to end the treatment and they are reintroducing themselves back into ordinary kind of day-to-day life, if you will. Not that I like the phrase new normal, in fact I detest it, but people know what I'm talking about when I use that term. When people are kind of getting back into that and they're freer from the medical fraternity, that's when things like anxiety really begins to kind of creep in, because things escalate for that person. And that in turn, I think, can actually have, it can make things problematic in terms of the caregiving role, because suddenly it's the reliance on the medical team is seen to depreciate, where the reliance on the caregiver is seen to escalate. So therefore, you get into this kind of little kind of, it's the pendulum swings, if you like. It swings back towards the home, towards the patient, and ultimately towards the caregiver. So the focus in the first 6 months is as I say, on the medical, and it's the reality that caregivers can often ignore their own needs and personal care needs. And as I say, significant association is found between carers' unmet personal care needs and higher distress. So as the cancer treatment continues, changes happen. Now this is sort of between the 6 and the 9 month phase, if you like, and changes arise in the carers' daily lives as they become more aware of their own health. And the intermediate treatment phase, carers who might have earlier put down their own needs or put them on the back burner, if you like, now begin to adjust to the caregiver role. And with that, in my view, there is an increasing need then to recognize their own needs. So, and then moving to the last phase, which is the kind of the sort of 9 month phase. Very interestingly, on this research, it seems to be the case that there is a positive correlation, or there's a correlation between unmet role management. So getting that kind of balance right between the tasks that I'm tasked with as a carer and my own needs, and that can actually lead to depression. So there seems to be an association between that specific element, that unmet role management. What is my role? So, and it's also worth saying that beyond the 9 months period, say in a situation where treatment has completed and carers have had time to adjust to the work-life balance and family roles, together with actually assisting their loved ones, there might be a sense that they can kind of take the foot off the gas. And if that's the case, well, life in some cases begins to return to something as it was before illness, perhaps. And I think this is actually often overlooked, that too is a transitional phase. So we had the first pre 6 months, which is one transition. And in the middle, there's a kind of a mini transition. But then at the end as well, there's another transition. So that's a lot of instability. There's a lot of navigating uncharted waters. And you can really see over time that how is that navigated? How do you develop the clear space, the clear head to kind of think these things through? And I suppose I'm kind of saying that these things are happening both in the foreground and in the background of people's lives. So one of the things that I suppose I'm kind of mindful of time, and I'm just kind of aware that I want to get to 2 other things really. So what I've noticed in my own work is that there seems to be an equation that develops in people's mind, particularly caregivers' minds, that the longer that I spend caregiving, it communicates or substantiates the idea that I'm competent at what I'm doing, and And sometimes I think that comes out of the sense of people losing kind of a sense of control, that actually there's something that outside of their purview to be able to figure out and to affect change on. So in the second research that I'm going to kind of speak about is that I'm just going to move quickly. So there's an idea that actually increased hours caregiving equals competence, but we get that back to that problem of burnout. That equation inevitably leads to burnout. And in the other research, rather than focusing on durations of time, they were interested in specific caregivers' frame of mind, and those that frame of mind, how it affected mental health outcomes. And the attitudes which the researchers focused on was caregiver perceived self-competency, so their capacity to feel competent, and a sense of meaning. Those two things. So what does self-competency actually mean? Well, ask yourself this question: how much do you feel that you are, all in all, a good caregiver to your loved one or to your patient? How confident do you feel about providing care to your loved one? So those two kind of questions capture that idea of self-competency. And caregiving self-esteem is the answer to the question, caring for patient is important to me, and caring for patients or for my loved one makes me feel good. So that's the quality of caregiving self-esteem. And lastly, the sense of meaning are to do with things like, to what extent do you feel peaceful? Do you feel that this is a purpose-driven, is this adding purpose and meaning to my life, the very work that I'm doing? I'm going to kind of speak off the cuff here because I'm conscious of time. So therefore that was the question there. And what do they find is, well, one of the things that I would want to remark on especially is that the other research concentrated on time, and I did wonder those kind of caregivers, to what extent they felt competent in what they were doing, if they were kind of just feeling their way, taking one task at a time. But what this research was very interesting, that as self-competency and caregiving self-esteem increases, this affected anxiety negatively. So the more competent that you feel over time, the more skilled up in terms of knowledge, and that you're on task and being briefed correctly and having those skills, it seems to have a real good effect in terms of lowering anxiety. People don't feel as out of control or subject to anxiety as they would do if they weren't as felt skilled up or as knowledgeable or as on point as perhaps they could be. It's when we're sort of almost chasing our tail all of the time, that's when we're kind of most susceptible, but not chasing our tails in terms of time or volume, but chasing our tails in terms of knowing what to do and knowing how to do the tasks correctly and knowing what is my responsibility. So when those two things are actually in place, that, and what that seems to have is a lowering of anxiety. As self-competency increases, it actually weakens the positive relationship between time spent caregiving and anxiety. So remember, in the previous research, there seemed to be the idea that the longer we spend caregiving, the higher the vulnerability to anxiety. But what we find is that as you become skilled, as people become skilled and better at what they're doing, that their knowledge increases, that challenges, it weakens that relationship between time giving what you're giving and anxiety, which I think is a very good thing to bear in mind. So, and also the sense of meaning, that's an interesting thing as well. in the sense that the sense of meaning is the purpose-driven kind of life, really. Interestingly, I gave a presentation a little while ago on things like the presentation was on what are the factors that push back against things like hopelessness and low mood in patients who are being treated for various kinds of blood cancers, which very similar to head and neck malignancies can go on for a very long time. So what they found was one of the things that really pushed back was this idea of meaning. It's important that we have some kind of, we appropriate some kind of meaning that this is positive. This is as I say, a positive kind of and very worthy thing to give my attention to. So that was again correlated to very positive outcomes and weakens the negative relationship between, again, time spent caregiving and lowered caregiving self-esteem. So finding number 2 is something interesting. What is the effect of all of this? The effect of this is that not that we become less anxious or less afraid. What happens instead? We become braver. We become more courageous. And I love that phrase by Sylvia. I think she called it balls to the wall idea. I think if I'm kind of quoting correctly. So it's that kind of courage I think it kind of can give you. So how to help yourself? I'm just going to whiz through it because I'm mindful of time. So to carers, that you have a responsibility to take care of yourself. You have a responsibility to take care of yourself, because if you fold, other things fold as well. So that's one thing. And taking time for yourself, that involves taking time for yourself. It absolutely takes time for yourself. And as much as you possibly can, getting outside sources of support, absolutely key. So using the wonderful facility that is the Swallows and all its associated elements is just a really wonderful resource that's available. So it's about reaching out. There is a fundamental connection between human connection and feeling sort of depressed and anxious. There is a correlation between the more connected we feel to other people, it has a robust effect on diminishing, lowering anxiety. So that's one of the key things to kind of take home, that reaching out is a really important element. As is being briefed correctly by the medical team and by other people who can actually really help you understand both what is in your charge to kind of cope with and what is in the patients themselves charge to kind of cope with, and what is the medical team's charge to manage as well. So being clear about what is my responsibility here.
John, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We're desperately running short on time. So
okay. Well, I can end it there. I mean, there was only one or two other points, but I can certainly end it there.
I don't want to cut you short because I find it absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure my caregiver colleagues do as well. But pardon me, we are desperately running short of time, and I wanted to give people a chance to ask questions and on this particular subject and to quiz you on some of the other things. If you want a couple minutes just to finish what you were doing, that's fine. And then
the last, I will take 2 minutes to quote from a book that I sort of read recently. Was Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life, and chapter 9 is a fascinating chapter. And one of the things he said in his own kind of work is set aside time to talk about the illness or the crisis and how it's managed every day, but actually confine this time to an hour. You don't let it spill into other things. You have to live. So this thing, you can't let the illness take over both your life or anybody else's. There must be room made for other things. So confining attention to one particular time in the day, that above of a lot of what I would suggest to caregivers has been a particularly helpful strategy. In addition, of course, to getting skilled up and getting being sort of appraised as to how to do things. Okay, I think I'll leave it at that.
All right, John. Thank you very much for that. So, guys, you've heard a lot from John there. Recognise any of those issues? Andrew, Debbie,
Yes.
Kelly.
Yeah, the question that springs into my mind is, John mentions being briefed and being upskilled is one of the words they use these days. How is that achieved? Because in my experience, it wasn't. The briefings that I received were what I happened to hear when I was sitting nearby, or very, very brief briefings, brief in both words, senses of the word. And I felt unprepared to deal with what I had to deal with. And sometimes what you were shown in the hospital and appeared to be relatively straightforward. And Joe had very similar issues to those described by the three ladies in the previous session. They seemed quite straightforward. When you got home and all that you saw out of the window when you looked out was fields and trees, no people to support you, it suddenly seemed a lot more difficult. I remember the first day we got back from the hospital after the original operation, and I'd been very, very briefly shown how to change the patch that was over the hole where the tracheostomy had been. And I remember taking it off and thinking, good grief, it didn't look that big when we were in hospital, but it reminded me of visits to Cheddar Gorge when I looked at it there. I thought, what do I do next? And yeah, and then a Tesco delivery arrived, and I had to just leave it while I went and dealt with the Tesco delivery, because that's the reality of life. So how can the health service brief people better, caregivers better, so that they can do the job to their best ability? And should they perhaps be appraising the ability of the caregiver to carry out these roles in the first place? Because there was no assessment of my competence or otherwise.
I've hiked Cheddar Gorge, actually, so I kind of know what you're talking about, believe it or not. And I do absolutely appreciate the kind of dilemma that kind of puts you in. There is, I think this is associated with prostate cancer, but there is what they call the Cancer Support Action Plan. And what it does, the fundamental key of that element is that it sees the patient and caregiver as the unit of concern. They don't split them. So that dyad, if you like, is seen as the unit of concern. It's not split off. So I think there's an increasing case to be made, particularly for clinicians to see that as is. In my experience of working in head and neck, particularly after acute treatment, it is the case that it is seen as a unit. This happened in Mussel's Hall Hospital. I worked with the speech and language therapist and the Macmillan. No, she wasn't Macmillan. She was the head and neck clinical nurse specialist. And maybe it was by virtue of the excellent team that I worked with there, is that what they tried to do was to brief people such as yourself, Andrew, in terms of what they might be expecting over time. So unfortunately, it could be the case that this is a kind of a postal code lottery. It could be kind of dependent on what kind of team you're actually with. But I all I can say is that I would really impress upon the teams that would be working with you or your loved one, that actually you need to know much more about what are the kinds of things you might be seeing. You know, can they give you some kinds of kind of heads up, if you like, as to you know, what you might have to cope with.
Can I bring Debbie in on this point, Debs? Because you're not only fairly at the beginning of your, you know, you've been doing it a while now, caregiving, but you're also doing it in a foreign country. So what sort of experiences have you come across, with regards to your experience?
With regards to what Andrew was talking about, with regard the amount of information, things are completely different here. You go to the hospital, you have your appointments, they tell you what's going to happen, and you go back for the appointment, it happens, and then you leave, and there isn't, you don't have a support group, you don't have the Macmillan type people here. So you have to find those yourselves. So we've done that ourselves, and there's an amazing charity in Javier where we live in Spain, Cancer Care, the Limwens nurses, and they're amazing, and they've been the people that supported us locally.
That does strike me as such an impoverished view of health, really, because that just sees health as just the doing to the patient or the doing to the person. Whereas actually the idea of health promotion it's a much broader idea, isn't it? That you're extending the idea of healthcare into something that actually needs to happen. So I really do, I just wish it was different for you there, Debbie, really.
Oh, but with the Swallows and with the support that we've received from our local charity as well, it's been amazing. I think the thing I found most difficult myself, and you touched on it, John, was that I didn't let people in, and people were inviting me out. Come out, you need a break. You're doing the caregiving. You need a break. You need to be out there and just come out for a coffee with us. But I refused because I saw that as my role was to be here with Stuart, to look after him, and I didn't want to go anywhere. And I still don't want to go anywhere. We're still on this journey, and I'm still refusing my friends' invitations. I do go out. I'll go to the supermarket or I'll wander around the shops. But as for socialising, I'm not really there yet. Not individually.
I applaud your friends they do encourage you out. I do applaud them, but I do take your point that you're just saying that you're not ready.
No.
And that's bottom line. I mean, you're just not ready, and that's that is the case for lots of people because it takes time. But this is but one chapter in a very long book, and things may change.
Exactly.
There may well be a different light at the end of the tunnel, in the sense of there might be, there may come a point where actually, you might just feel that inclination to, remember your own self in the middle of this.
Absolutely. But I think when your daily life revolves around the person that you're looking after or caring with, you want to concentrate on them, and it's back to the I'm fine, I can deal with myself later when everything's sorted itself out, but in the meantime I put my life on hold and I'll do everything I can to be there.
I'm asking this very playfully now, but there's no Irish blood in you by any chance, is there?
No. Italian.
Italian. You're just kind of making me think, because that's a very Irish mother deal, what you've just talked there. Like it's kind of like a variant of Mrs. Doyle. She's about taking care of everybody else, but actually, thinking about herself. Well, that's a little bit down the path.
Can I interrupt just for a second and ask a question of Kelly? Because Kelly, I take it you're not a caregiver at the moment, is that? Yeah.
No, so I'm here from Wiltshire Farm Foods. Jenny is also, I think, amongst us. So I work in product development, and we look after create meals, basically, which are texture modified for people with dysphagia or swallowing difficulties. So if someone's been diagnosed by a speech and language therapist and has been asked to follow a texture modified diet, then hopefully they would find our meals obviously very useful. So we mold them to try and get them to resemble like normal food, and hopefully yeah, hopefully people find them useful.
I've got a $64,000 question for you here.
Go on.
And if it hits the mark, you can send me a check. I'll gratefully accept it. I understand. I've seen your catalogs. I've been tempted as a I don't have a problem eating or swallowing, but I've been tempted to, put a few orders in and just, see what they look, because they look pretty good. But what I wanted to ask you was, how do you think what you are producing and providing for the patient will make the life and assist the life of the caregiver to give a better quality of hopefully nutrition to their patient, bearing in mind that some of these patients are going to be totally resistant.
Yeah. So we have the regular meals in the range. So you've probably seen them. There's a couple of hundred of them. And then the ones that I'm really referring to are probably the ones found towards the back. So the texture modified range. So the pureed meals, if somebody needed to have a pureed diet. But it takes, if you can imagine, there's loads of foods that people cannot eat when they need a texture modified diet, such as things like peas because of the husks or the sweet corn or the stringiness of green beans. And so hopefully we're taking all of that risk away. So somebody's not going to choke as they eat the meal, that they can feel that the meal is safe for them to have. But also with the molding, and we brown certain elements to try and resemble certain cooking processes, to just make it much more visually appealing for somebody. It's just taking all of that headache away for not only the person eating it, but if somebody had to prepare one of these meals to these guidelines that are set, that we need to design them to meet. I'm just hoping it makes it easier. And obviously we're making sure that the nutrition is right. So adding calories, adding protein in. So trying to stop people from losing weight. Hopefully taking all of that away and just making it easier.
Okay, that's great. Debbie, can I just come back to you and ask you, I know you've already told John that, well, you told all of us that you feel dedicated to the role, the caregiver role, and it hasn't enabled you to pick up on an active individual social life yet. But at some point, something must have happened for you to make contact, to look for some help or some support or some guidance or whatever it was. Something must have triggered. Can you remember what that was, what that feeling was, and where you went and how you dealt with it?
The local support I've received, it was Stuart had his first operation. He had a floor of mouth cancer. He had a neck dissection. He recovered from the surgery. He then had all his radiotherapy sessions, and a month after the treatment finished, he had another lump come up on the other side of his neck, and he had another cancerous tumor. And it was at that point then that my whole world felt like it was falling apart. And I went out for a drive one day, and I sat in my car, and I tried to message a friend, and she was busy. She's allowed to be busy, and she's got her life, and I didn't know what to do. And I found myself crying my eyes out in the car, and I went into the local village, into the local town, and there was a charity shop, a cancer charity shop, and I walked in there, and I just stood at the counter in there and said, I need help, I need somebody to talk to. And that's when they've contacted me, and we've gone from there. And they've been very, very supportive.
That's amazing. So you actually, it was like just the bubble burst.
Yes, prior to that, I had family did come to visit us, Stuart's brother actually and his wife, and they visited us, and they could see that I was crumbling. And they said to me, you really need to get some help. You need to have some counselling. And I took that as a sign of weakness. What do you mean I need counselling? I can cope. I'm Debbie. I can deal with everything. I've got broad shoulders. Give it to me. I can deal with it. But I clearly couldn't, and they were right. But I didn't want to admit it because I saw that as me being weak. So I've got the help and the support that I do need. My
goodness, I definitely recognise that syndrome of the I can cope. Andrew, same for you?
Yeah. Although I haven't really had very much other than through Swallows, which we accessed really after our journey had finished. So at the stages we're talking about now, we hadn't been put onto Swallows at all. But knowing that you can talk to other people, albeit now remotely, which actually for us is very enabling, given that we live in quite a remote area, has been extremely helpful, because you don't feel as though it's just you. You know that there are other people in the same situation, and you know that you can perhaps speak to those people and see how they've approached a situation, because the likelihood that the situation, the difficulty you're facing is one that hasn't been faced before is very unlikely to be the case, and somebody will have a pearl of wisdom to share with you. You just need to be able to access it. And just going back to the Wiltshire Farm Foods section, I've got a completely different angle on that, which is that Joe was being fed through a egg rig, whichever you wish to call it, and I was having to push everything through. In the film at the start, Sharon was saying, quite understandably, that in Chrissy's case it wasn't his legs and his arms, it was just cancer. Well, in Joe's case it was a leg as well, because when her peg was fitted, she fell over in hospital with the pain and broke her ankle in 2 places, so she was totally immobile as well as everything else. So I had to do everything, and that meant preparing all of the meals, and that meant preparing my meals just for me. I hadn't got time to do that. So I was going to the local Tesco, and the word local and Tesco, or indeed any other supermarket that might be available where we live, they don't go together, because supermarkets are not local to us. So I was rushing all the way to the, without exceeding the speed limit, I might add, to the nearest supermarket, grabbing whatever ready meal I could with no concern for quality off the shelves, and rushing back again because she might need the loo. If only I'd thought about ordering some that I could have delivered that were balanced and so forth, that I could cook in that way, that would have been better. But I didn't know about them. I do now, because my mum's quite old. Looking at me on the picture, you'll see she's probably about 60. And she has Wiltshire Farm Foods now, so I know about them. So not only could they support the patient, they could also support the caregiver to enable them to have time to spend to themselves, rather than experiencing that not particularly rewarding situation of preparing a meal just for yourself while you get ready to push something down a tube for somebody else. And then I did go through the pureeing everything and putting all the carrot in a shape on a plate for Joe, so that it was the same shape as a carrot, even though it was mushed. I thought of that one. But I feel that they could help both sides, not just the patient.
Guys, have you got any comeback on that? Kelly, Jenny?
No, it's really, really good to hear, actually, that perspective, that I think sometimes we focus on the patient, and actually if there's another benefit. I know, even, well, just working here, I end up taking them home for my children, and that's just because I'm being a bit lazy. So yeah, sometimes on busy days a prepared meal can certainly be helpful.
Maybe a combo pack of a mushy option for the patient, and a more solid version, more natural version for the caregiver, packaged together as a
good suggestion. Yeah.
Great idea, Derek.
Hey, Debbie. Yeah, Debbie. Can I just ask you? Obviously, you made that very brave step to acknowledge that you needed some help and assistance. How do you feel you need help and assistance going forward from where you are right now?
I have to say that a couple of days after I went into the charity shop and I spoke to the people there, I messaged Sharon, and her response was, "Why didn't you phone me?" But I didn't want to bother her. You know, you're in a different country. I'm here in Spain, and it was a slap on the wrist for me from myself, because I know that's what you guys, Chris and Sharon, that's what you're there for. So I took that on board. Where do I go from here? I'm having weekly counselling sessions with a counsellor, and we talk and we laugh and I cry, and that's what I need to do. I need to take some time for me. I need to talk to people. I need to let people in. I need to accept help.
Okay, we've got to wrap this up fairly shortly, guys. Got a couple of minutes left. Sadly, we're not being bombarded with too many questions, which is why I'm asking most of them. I'd like to ask John, just before we wrap up, John, you've obviously heard a lot of stories. You've heard, I have this issue that it's caregivers refusing to ask for help. They all think they're supermen or superwomen. How do we change that attitude? Or is that just something we have to wait until, as in Debbie's case, the bubble burst and she finally sort of made the request?
I think we live in a culture that's kind of endemic with the idea that you have to look quite together, really. So there's quite significant societal kind of forces in that idea that I have to be seen as coping, really. There's a very interesting book written by Brené Brown. People may or may not have come across her, but she wrote a book recently in the last maybe 2 years called Daring Greatly. And in it, she talks about this idea of vulnerability that actually, I think Debbie mentioned that idea that I had to be coping, that I had to keep all this plates, I'm paraphrasing here, plate spinning, that I was kind of in control. So the bottom line of that is that I can't show vulnerability here. And I think there's an equation that happens in people's minds that vulnerability equals weakness. And of all of the psychological artifacts to break, or the psychological myths to break, that's the one that needs breaking, in answer to your question. That actually my vulnerability, my need, equals weakness. Because interestingly, vulnerability in you equals inadequacy in me.
Okay, thank you, John. I think we're going to call it a day. We've run over by about 4 minutes, so I apologise to that. But I'd just like to thank Kelly and Jenny joining us from Wiltshire, Andrew and Debbie, 2 regular faces that I'm used to. Nice to see you guys, and nice to see you smiling, Debs. Andrew, you have a good session tomorrow. Dr. John, thank you so much for sharing your insights and takings with us. Much appreciated. I'll now hand back to our conference president.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, no, I mean, this is an area that I think does warrant a lot more conversation, in all fairness. I think not only are carers not necessarily recognised as much from the health organisations, but actually they also don't like to look at themselves either and show any signs. So it's something that we could probably discuss a lot further. What do you feel, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, Derek knows that here at the Swallows, we really do want to bring forward the caregivers journey. Sharon always used to say we're on the same journey, but on different tracks. So, we do need to bring those tracks together somehow. Sharon and Derek and Andrew and, a couple of others have been working on this for almost 2 years now, and we're trying all sorts of things. So there's a lot more work to be done on it, but having a conversation at this conference now, it certainly helps bring it to life. Andrew and Debbie are great touch speakers. John has helped with the psychological side. And I just think we need to do more work, David, right across the NHS, because, if caregivers weren't there, the NHS around the UK, would implode. Because, how can you have someone that today is a secretary, their husband or partner gets diagnosed with cancer tomorrow, and then the following day you put them out as a nurse with no training? You wouldn't do that in the hospital. You wouldn't go out there thinking, oh, we're short of some nurses. Let's go and see who's wandering in the streets and fetch them in and let them nurse our head and neck patients. Yet we do that with our caregivers. And we've got to stop that without doing some sort of formal information, something that we can work on. And I know Derek and Sharon are working on a leaflet, and we're looking at information. But the hard bit is getting caregivers to open up. Because if you ask a caregiver to tell the story, they will always go back to their patient. And that's one of the problems we have, is getting them to say what they really want and get them to open up. And there's no one better than that than Derek. And he's a champion for it. Sharon's the champion, and so is Andrew. So let's hope, with tomorrow's session on caregivers tomorrow, we can take a little bit further.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so.